Before we start, let me do some land acknowledgement, and then I will present our distinguished guest speaker. So the Center for Mexican Studies at UCLA acknowledges our presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrieleño and Tomba peoples. We're very happy to have with us Dr. Viridiana Rios, who will do an assessment of the first 100 days of Claudia Sheinbaum presidency in Mexico. This is such a timely conversation. Thank you, Viridiana, for being willing to participate despite being returning so soon from Chile and being jet lagged. Let me say a few words about your very distinguished career. Um, and of course, all of us who follow Mexican politics, Viridiana's columns in El País and Milenio are a must read. She writes columns there, but also she's affiliated with the summer school at Harvard University, where she teaches U.S. Mexico politics. And also, she has two books in Spanish out. And the first one is Así no es, Don't Believe Everything You Hear About Meritocracy, the middle class, classism, wage, and income. And the other one is No es Normal, the rigged game that fuels Mexican equality and how to change it. And I just would like to read the first paragraph of how Dr. Viridiana Rios introduces herself, which I find it very attractive, especially for this topic. And in her bio, Dr. Rios says, I am a member of a new generation of academics that rejects the notion that academia is inextricably separated from policy decisions and social impact. Instead, I rely on data analysis, research journalism, and close collaboration with academic peers to develop a neat understanding of Mexico's most pressing social problems and to design and promote novel solutions to them. With that, we're looking forward for your assessment of the first 100 days of President Sheinbaum in Mexico. And of course, next week will be the inauguration of President Trump here in Washington, D.C. So I know
Yes.
you're an observer of both binational politics. So we're looking forward for your comments. So the floor is yours, Viridiana. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Gaspar, for the invitation. I'm very, very happy to be here. Ariadne, Brian, thank you so much for helping us organize this. I'm a Mexican, so like you can hear my accent. So if at some point you need me to repeat something or say something again, just please raise your hand or add a comment here, and I can do it. So let me start with a little bit of context. So let me first tell you what we are going to do today. So first, I want to do a little bit of context and tell you more or less how we got here and how Mexico, managed to elect a female president, uh, particularly in a country where about 60% of Mexicans have kind of like negative perception and negative biases against females in positions of power. So then first, let me give you a little bit of context of that. Then I want to talk about why Claudia Sheinbaum won, right? Like some specific policies that help her party become extremely popular in Mexico, and I'm going to give you some figures about that. And then finally, I want to go into like the nitty-gritty of exactly what we have observed Sheinbaum, president of Mexico, doing in her first 100 days. I think 100 days, honestly, I feel is like a very, I'm not very happy with the metric because I think 100 days is too little. But well, here we are, and we're going to assess so far how she is doing. So let me first start by a little bit of context. So Mexico became a democracy in 1997. And that happened mainly because an electoral reform was approved and was negotiated between the old traditional hegemonic party of Mexico, the PRI, that was basically in power since the end of the revolution, changing a little bit of name so far, but mainly the main party since the end of the revolution up until 2000. That is the first year that Mexico faces a transition. But the PRI negotiated, along with the opposition of the time, an electoral reform that basically created the rules of the game that allowed Mexican democracy to exist. That is why, for the first time in the year 2000, Mexico had a transition. The transition meant that basically the PRI left power, and then Mexico was ruled by center right wing parties for almost 2 decades. From 2000 to 2012, Mexico was ruled by the PAN, a business-oriented movement that was very business friendly, very much to the right of politics, center right, I would say, conservative on cultural values, and also conservative on economic policies. Then, from 2012 to 2018, Mexico was ruled again by the PRI. In 2018, by the way, that PRI government, the return of the PRI, was a very, I would say, difficult period for the country, because a lot of corruption scandals broke up into the media, and therefore Mexicans basically lost a lot of their trust into democracy. By the end of the period of PRI, from 2012 to 2018, only 9% of Mexicans, this is one of my favorite statistics, because it's terrible. Only 9% of Mexicans believed that the government ruled for the people. And the overwhelming majority of Mexicans believe that the government was only ruling for themselves or for the elites. This is with data of the Latino Barometer. So in 2018, Mexico's political leadership changed. And this is, I would say, probably the most important change that Mexico has had since the 2000s, because this is the first time that Mexico starts being ruled by a party on the, I would say, center left, although there are some characteristics of this party, Morena, that are difficult to assess. And, some parts are actually kind of like right wing, and other parts, but I would say in general, and given particularly the results that I'm going to tell you a little bit about that, I think we can say that Morena is a center left-wing party. So basically, Morena takes power. Morena is a very young party. It was created in 2014, and it takes power with López Obrador. I'm sure everybody of you guys have heard about him. So AMLO, that's also how people known López Obrador, becomes an extremely popular president. Extremely popular president. Actually, is one of the few presidents that didn't really change his popularity over time. Like, he starts more or less around, I'm gonna say, like 76% of approval, and he ends more or less like around 74, 75% approval. So he has times, that are like a little bit more difficult and so on, but he was a very popular president for almost the whole time that he was in power. Morena is a fascinating party because it is very new. So in 2014, basically, like, we start existing. And now it's like, basically it became the main and most important party in Mexico. So what we have is that currently Morena, of course, has the presidency with President Claudia Sheinbaum, but it also has 2/3 of the Senate, a supermajority, 2/3 of the legislative, of the lower chamber, diputados, Morena also has rules over 24 states out of 32 states in Mexico, and they also have a majority in 27 of the state congresses of 32. So as you can see, it's an extremely successful party. I don't remember exactly who was telling me that this may be the most successful party in Latin America in the last decade, and I think that is true, because it's actually like their success is exponential. Like, they basically didn't exist in 2014, right? So and look at that, like it grew very fast. So how and why? Let me move into this section. Why Morena has been so successful, and why particularly Claudia Sheinbaum was so successful. Claudia was elected with about 60% of the vote. No other president in the history of Mexican democracy had ever obtained that amount of votes, that share of the vote. So it's like, this is a multi-party system. So like having 60% when there are like around, I'm gonna say 7 parties, That's very impressive. And the question is why, and I would say that the reason why Claudia won with such a large margin uh, is three things, right? So the first one, and probably I would say the most important one, is the labor policies that Morena implemented. So AMLO ruled the country from 2018 up until 2024. And during that time, AMLO tripled the minimum wage at the border. He doubled the minimum wage in the rest of the country. He also approved a series of labor reforms that, for the first time, allowed Mexicans to democratically elect their unions. So that basically changed the representation of workers in many areas and in many companies, leading to also important increases in the amount of benefits that some workers in formality had. He also reformed outsourcing laws that basically had been implemented, I would say maybe like a decade ago, and had significantly reduced the amount of benefits that workers were getting. And when you add all of these reforms, all of these like changes in how labor works in Mexico, then you observe that there are very significant reductions in poverty because of these policies. So about 5 million Mexicans left poverty. That's extremely significant given that before 2018, Mexico was not capable of reducing poverty whatsoever. We had been like, it was like a period of like 10 years that basically the numbers of poverty have been very stable. And then suddenly, from 2018 up to, we have numbers for 2022, we observe this very large diminution in poverty. There are also significant reductions in inequality. I have a statistic that I really like, which is that the share of income that is concentrated on the top 1% in Mexico, right? And during the first 2 decades after democratization, so from 2000 up until 2018, the concentration had gone from 12%. So 12% of the total national income was concentrated in the top 1%. So it had gone from 12% up until 30%. So that's like, basically it tripled, right? And that increase is the largest increase in the world. Like literally, we have information for like, I think like maybe like 200 countries, and Mexico was the country that observed the largest increase in this specific statistic. And then what we're observing now from 2018 up to now is a very significant reduction in that. Basically, is the most important reduction in inequality, in income inequality, which is different than wealth inequality, but is the most important reduction in income inequality that we have observed since the 60s, since the period so-called of the Mexican miracle. So that was like very significant for people. Then another thing that made Claudia very successful was that AMLO implemented a series of cash transfer programs, universal cash transfer programs, non-conditional, that basically landed very well among voters. So today, about 14 million Mexicans received cash transfer. They also receive larger cash transfers than before. So now the cash transfer is 55% larger than it was during the period before 2018. And that was a policy that was very popular. Actually, when you ask on the surveys, on polls, like when you ask people, why do you like about like López Obrador, what's the main and most important policy that you like? Most people refer to the cash transfers. So this became a very popular cash transfer. So cash transfers are mostly given to older people. So they call it the pension because it's like universal pension. People receive $300 every 2 months, and you have to be 65 years or older in order to receive this cash transfer. Now, even if that money doesn't seem a lot, in the US, it is very significant in a country like Mexico. For example, consider that the average wage, well, let's say the minimum wage, for example. The minimum wage is about $300, maybe $350 a month, right? So receiving $300 every 2 months is something extremely significant for people, right? Like it's something that changes basically how people live, whether people can buy their medicines or not. I actually made a study to like try to understand how people was using the money of the cash transfers. And it turns out that the two things that they use the money more like commonly are medicines and also food, right? So you basically basic food, right? So that's how people use them then. So we said labor policies. That's a very successful policy of AMLO and Morena that helped Claudia won. Second, social assistance. And then third, I would say that third is the narrative and the positioning that Morena has done of themselves, right? So basically, AMLO's government positioned himself as the most important and the most visible opponent to the previous administrations, to these center right governments that I was telling you about. These governments that really kind of like mostly failed to deliver results to most of the population because poverty was completely stagnated. The minimum wage had lost almost, I would say, I would have to check the number, but I think it's 80% of the purchase power of the minimum wage had been lost during these governments, and like a decade before, during the period of Mexican neoliberalism that goes more or less from 1982 up until we could say 2018. And also it's like it was they were administrations that they had really kind of like they were very bad position, I would say, among Mexicans. And I was telling you before that up until 2018, remember, only 9% of Mexicans believe that the government rule for the people, right? That most of the Mexicans believe the government was ruling for the elites. And then since AMLO took power, we have like followed that measure. And the last year, 2023, that we have, that measure is 40%, 40. So basically, the number of Mexicans or the rate of Mexicans that believe that the government rules for the people has fourfolded, increased 400%, right? So that's, that's a very visible of like what AMLO and what Morena represented for the people. There is also a little bit of there is also like some additional factors, I would say. AMLO, like particularly AMLO, Claudia a little bit less, but AMLO was a very kind of like populist president. So he was constantly talking about how he was close to the people, the representative of the people, that he was like wielding this campaign against the power of the elites. Of course, everybody that opposed AMLO was a member of the elite and was disqualified as an opponent, a conservative, a person that was corrupt. This also includes the press and includes, everybody basically that opposed López Obrador. But he also, he changed also the way that kind of like presidents behaved before. He was like more, I would say, vernacular about how he portrayed himself with the people. He regularly provided, for example, when he organized like a dinner at the presidential residency, he wouldn't offer like, kind of like elegant food or like French food and so on, as other presidents used to. Instead of that, he would offer tamales, which is like this Mexican food made of corn. So he would offer tamales, and he would have a daily conference in which he would do everything, basically, from like singing, talking bad about the opposition, to to also presenting a lot of the policies that he was delivering. Right? So he had a very special, I would say, way to use power, and he was perceived as a politician that was honest, and he managed to also gather a lot of love from the population and became a beloved politician. So Claudia kind of like inherited all this, right? Like when Claudia takes power, she basically she wins because people are happy with the labor policies. They are happy with the reductions in poverty, with social assistance, and also they are happy with Morena, a country that is not representing the previous technocratic elite. Instead, is representing a party that is actually, in favor of the people. So what has Claudia done during these 100 days? I would say that the first thing you need to know is that a lot of the policies that Claudia had implemented were policies that were originally thought and originally drafted by López Obrador. So López Obrador, in February 2013, he creates a set of 18 reforms that he would like to implement, but he cannot implement because back in the time, Morena didn't have the supermajority in Congress that they have now. So in February 2023, he says, look, he calls it my Plan C, right? There is a history of why it's Plan C, but I'm not going to give you all those boring details. But basically, he presents his plan, which is 18 constitutional reforms that he would like to approve if he had the supermajority, right? And then Sheinbaum starts campaigning, saying that Morena needs to win the supermajority in order to improve these 18 reforms. Some of these reforms are actually very controversial. For example, there was a judicial reform that was actually implemented by Sheinbaum, but the original idea was by López Obrador, a judicial reform to basically completely change the Supreme Court, and also not only the Supreme Court, but all the federal judges. And instead of electing the judges through the civil service and the Supreme Court justices through the Senate, instead of that, having all of these judges elected, right? Like directly elected by the people. So it's going to be a very complicated election, but basically that was the idea. So basically AMLO presents this set of 18 reforms, and Sheinbaum starts campaigning on these reforms, and people basically embrace this agenda. They embrace this agenda. They embrace Morena. They embrace the party for all of the reasons that I previously commented. So a large part of the first 100 days of Sheinbaum had been devoted to approving these reforms. So far, let me check. I think so far she had implemented 12 of the 18 reforms originally proposed by AMLO, and she had also added 2 or 3 that are very important for her and for her own independent agenda. One about human rights, another one about housing, and one more about an industrial policy program, right? But basically all the rest are policies that were that came from Morena. The very fact that she is implementing these policies that come from or were originally drafted and thought by López Obrador had led people to, in my opinion, misunderstand what is happening in Mexico and argue that the person that is really ruling the country is López Obrador, and that Sheinbaum is only like a puppet of López Obrador that is implemented policies that came from before. I think that is wrong, and I think that's a very mistaken way of reading Mexican politics. And the real way to read this is that both AMLO and Sheinbaum are members of the same party that shares a political agenda, and therefore they are advancing the same policies because they belong to the same coalition, right? Like it would be the same if you have, I don't know, 2 Democratic parties, 2 Democratic presidents ruling in the US, like it would be kind of like weird to pretend that suddenly a Democratic president would be change the agenda completely and now behave like a Republican. That just couldn't happen, right? You shouldn't expect that to happen, particularly when the party is so popular as it is the case in Mexico with Morena. So what we are really observing is a continuation of the same party in power and the continuation of a party that has been very consistent in its agenda. This is interesting because, as I was telling you before, the agenda of Morena is very difficult to classify because there are some policies of Morena that are kind of like right wing. Let me give you an example. Morena has a fascination for the use of the military. And they really like to use the military for doing basically everything from like construction, taking care of the airports, having their own companies, taking control of some of the trains that they are currently constructing, and also, of course, becoming the national police. Basically, López Obrador completely eliminated the federal police, and he substituted the federal police with a new enforcement group called the National Guard, but the National Guard basically is the military, right? That's 80% military, so members of the military. So then it's basically now like a militarized country on the sense that policing is mostly done by the militaries at the federal level. And I emphasize at the federal level because at the local level and at the state level, Mexico has other police departments, completely civilian, right? Some of them are actually very good and very competent. For example, you have one in Nuevo León that is very competent. In some parts of Jalisco that is very competent. But in other states, the polices are much less professionalized and much more corrupt. Thinking about states like maybe Guerrero, like Nayarit, and so on. So like the differences between the local polices in terms of professionalization, corruption, and capacity to implement the law are enormous, right? And at the federal level, they have the army. And then there are other policies of Morena that are very left-wing. Like think about all the policies that I told you about, wages, about like gender rights, about like increasing the minimum wage and so on, like reducing poverty, reducing inequality, like all that is like, very right wing, very left wing. And then there are other policies that you should expect from a left wing coalition, for example, a fiscal reform to tax the rich. And Morena really kind of like doesn't like to go there, right? They have been like avoiding to have this discussion. They don't want to move that. They feel that if they implement a fiscal reform, maybe capitals are going to leave Mexico and we're not going to have investment, so they are like very careful when they think about a fiscal reform. And this, for example, has had periods where it has been frankly dramatic. For example, during the pandemic, when you look at the amount of money that Mexico, like the expenditure of the Mexican government, Mexico was one of the governments that was more austere, right? Like with the least expenses. And this is precisely because they didn't have money, they didn't want to get indebted, they didn't want to tax the rich, and they just decided, okay, so then we're gonna, go through the pandemic with whatever money we have, and that's very little, so let's just do it like that. And they didn't do a fiscal reform, which was very criticized, and I had been also very critical of this decision. So let me move now concretely into what we have observed in the last 100 days of Sheinbaum, and I'm gonna divide it in what I think are like good policies, what I think are policies that are very controversial that I personally don't like, and then other policies that I think we have to observe with caution, and maybe we need a little bit more time to assess what's going to be the end result of that. So first, on the things that I think Claudia has done well, that is just like, very good policies for Mexico. I would say one is more increases in the minimum wage. She approved an increase of 12% in real terms to the minimum wage. And also she approved a specific reform that requires that the increases of the minimum wage always have to be above inflation. Like, so if inflation is regularly in between 3 and 4% in Mexico, then the minimum wage has always to increase a little bit above that. So I think that's It's a very good policy, and Mexico has some margin to increase salaries. So like we can continue. Her goal is that by the end of her term in 2030, she's going to increase the minimum wage 50% in real terms. So remember that AMLO doubled the minimum wage. So Claudia is thinking about increasing it 50%. AMLO doubled the minimum wage in the country, and at the border, there is like a special zone where he tripled the minimum wage. Second policy that I think is very good is the housing reform. So Sheinbaum is planning on building 1 million houses for affordable houses for people that are for workers basically, and particularly for workers of low wages. And she created a reform to allow Infonavit, which is the institution that currently almost the only thing that they do is giving credits for housing. And now instead of only giving credits, what they are going to do is actually constructing. And also they are going to have the capacity to not only sell houses, but also rent houses. So the state now is going to own houses that is going to rent below market prices to families that need these houses. And this is great because Mexico is currently facing, particularly in Mexico City, a crisis of lack of housing, and it's just terrible. So this reform, I think, is going in the right direction. A third thing, finally, that I think she has done very well is the creation of an agency of digital transformation. Basically, this agency is like a minister, and what they are going to do is provide free internet to most of the regions in Mexico, particularly focusing on regions that currently do not have access to internet or have access to internet but is very expensive for them. And also, this is an agency that is going to transform how the government do. Basically, they want to reduce red tape, right? And turn many of the procedures that are currently done on paper, that you have to do in person and so on, digitally, right? So now you're going to have, I don't know, if you want to take out your passport, you're going to basically do the whole process online, and it's going to be way more fast and so on. So I think, those three are very good policies that she has implemented. Second, most controversial policies, right? So I would say that probably the most controversial is that she eliminated the Institute of Access to Information. It's called INAI in Spanish. And also she eliminated the Antitrust Commission. The Antitrust Commission and INAI, both of these institutions were autonomous institutions, meaning they didn't depend of the executive. And now she eliminated these institutions, and now they are going to depend on the executive. But this is, a little bit of a problem because, of course, the executive does not have the incentives to provide access to information as much as the previous institution had, because the government, they don't necessarily like to be so transparent. So, for example, many journalistic pieces had been done previously thanks to INAI, because INAI basically pushed and demanded many federal institutions to provide information to the people. So you would request a piece of information and they had to give it to you, And now this access to information is going to be part of the executive, and therefore, I don't know if the executive is going to have the same incentives, probably not. So this is a significant reduction in transparency of the Mexican government, and also in our capacity to monitor the Mexican government, because the access to information is probably going to be more difficult and diminished. Also, the Antitrust Commission was an autonomous institution. I don't think it was the best Antitrust Commission. I actually had a lot of criticisms to the Antitrust Commission. However, I'm not sure that we have to see how this works, but I'm not sure that an Antitrust Commission that depends on the president is going to necessarily be better, because the president may have some conflict of interest. and may not want to go after some of the monopolies because of political reasons, right? Because the president has political reasons not to do it. Second thing that I think is extremely controversial and that I personally don't like is the treatment that Sheinbaum has given to the Human Rights Commission. So the Human Rights Commission used to be also an autonomous institution before AMLO, and then AMLO elected a person to be the president that basically kind of like she was a party loyalist, and she stopped doing what the Human Rights Commission would do, which is protecting people from violations of human rights, even if those violations were performed by the government itself. And because she was a party loyalist, she basically froze the commission, and this commission de facto kind of like stopped existing because we wouldn't do almost anything. And Sheinbaum ratified this person to keep being the president of the Human Rights Commission. So that's another 6 years in which this commission that is very important in Mexico is gonna be diminished, be weakened, and be almost non-existent. So the only thing that the that the Human Rights Commission does now is celebrating what the government does, right? But besides that, not much. A third thing that I think it's quite problematic is that she has continued with the austerity policies implemented by López Obrador. And here, what we observe is basically, again, a fascination of Morena, and this comes from López Obrador, but Sheinbaum has kept in the same direction of reducing the resources that the government has. They are shrinking every single corner of the government that they can in order to increase the amount of money that is given on the cash transfers. Remember that the cash transfers are very politically kind of very good policy because people really love it, right? But to do that, they have not done a fiscal reform or increase the amount of resources that the state has. Instead, what they have done is cutting from different institutions like the environment, like culture, like some parts of the economic minister, and so on, in order to increase social spending. And this is a problem because this has weakened the capacity of the government to perform. Like we have many ministers that are that don't have enough people to work properly, that they haven't increased salaries basically in 6 years, and now they said they are not going to increase salaries another 6 years for the people working for the government. And that's again, problematic because you need good salaries in order to get talent. There have been increases to doctors, nurses, and teachers, right? So kind of like those public workers, actually they have been benefited, but not for the rest of the structure of the government. Then finally, let me tell you a few politics that I would say we have to observe with caution, right? Which are, again, policies that are very controversial, but that we really don't know what's kind of the end point of this. The first one that I will classify as observed with caution, let's say, is the judicial reform. So the judicial reform is probably the most, I would say, profound reform of the judicial system that Mexico has had probably since, well, I would say since 1994, but actually I think that is larger than 1994. So I would say that probably in 100 years. And again, as I was telling you before, the reform consists on eliminating substituting current judges, federal judges, for elected judges, and then doing the same at the local level. And eventually, in the next 3 or 4 years, substituting also all local judges and for judges that are going to be elected. What's the reason for concern? Okay, so the reasons for concern are I would say, mainly two. One is that because Morena is currently very popular, then the judges are going to be elected and are going to be also kind of like Morena, prone to be Morena loyalists, right? Or like more prone to interpret the law according to what Morena would wish to, right? So the idea here is that before the judicial reform kind of like inhibited Morena from implementing many of the policies that they wanted to implement. Let me give you an example. Morena wanted to have an energy reform to give the state the capacity to have a monopoly over the distribution of electricity. And that's a policy that was very controversial, and many private companies basically went to the Supreme Court demanding that the policy was not implemented, demanding that the state didn't have that capacity because the state couldn't become a monopoly, and like they had like previous contracts that allow them to provide as privates that provide electricity and so on, right? I'm simplifying this a lot, but basically the Supreme Court inhibit the electrical reform of AMLO and allow the companies to keep operating as before, you know? So like that, there were many other reforms, an electoral reform, a reform to increase and facilitate the capacity of the state to imprison people for a set of different crimes. Like there was like a long list of reforms that AMLO tried to implement, and then he was blocked by the judicial system, by the judicial branch. And now, with judges being elected, and because people in general in Mexico, most people vote for Morena, they are like a very popular party. The idea is that now this is not going to happen. And the judicial reform is going to be kind of like more similar to the executive and to the legislative branch. And therefore, you may lose the capacity of the judicial reform to check, to be, you know, a check and balance to the other two branches. The second concern, that the first one is already very strong, right? Because it's basically reducing, you know, in the theory of liberal democracy, you need checks and balances in order for the government not to become authoritarian, right? And this is reducing those checks and balances, and is making the judicial system to be more similar and more prone to whatever political force is more popular, right? So this is important because it's not necessarily that they are going to favor Morena, right? Like if people tomorrow change their minds, if Mexicans tomorrow start hating Morena, they love the opposition, probably they are going to be more prone towards voting for the judges that are closer to the opposition, right? So it's not necessarily that this is going to favor Morena. This is just going to favor whoever is popular, right? And if a popular government is in power, then that government is going to have much more capacity to implement their agenda because the judicial reform is not going to block it, right? So you can be in favor or against that, but you know there are concerns about the reduction in the capacity of checks and balances. That's for sure. And then the second concern with the judicial reform is uncertainty, right? Because basically the whole, like imagine this, all judges, like every single one, all the federal judges are going to change. And they are going to change in two blocks. So half of them are going to get elected in 2025, this year, and then half of them in 2026. No, 2027, sorry. So then imagine, like that's a very important change for how the judicial system works. That's gonna probably create some uncertainty because we're not gonna necessarily understand at the beginning how these judges are gonna make decisions. Like there's gonna be a period of a learning curve for the whole system to learn first how to organize the elections and how to, you know, become a judge, right? Like these people are gonna, some of them hadn't been judges before because there is not a requirement to have experience as a judge. The only requirement is that you are a lawyer, and another simple requirements like you present, you get an interview, you present an essay and so on, but it's going to be very open, right? So there is going to be probably less knowledge of how to be a judge at the beginning. A second policy that I would say observe with caution and has happened during the first 100 days of Sheinbaum is the change in security policies. So AMLO was very, I would say he was very adverse to using the force against drug cartels. And I think this is something that he learned from a previous government, the government of Calderon. Calderon was in power from 2012 to 2018. No, sorry, from 2006 to 2012. And when Calderon was in power, I'm sure some of you know, he started a very strong offensive against drug cartels. He started battling drug cartels as basically as nobody has done before. And instead of that, reducing violence and helping Mexico control drug cartels, what that caused was that the drug cartels fracture in different pieces that battle themselves for turf, increasing the violence of the country and also allowing these like small cells to kind of like diversify the portfolio of their criminal activities. So rather than only being like a big cartel that was sending drugs to the US and just like completely specialized, let's say, into the drug business, they fracture in smaller cells that didn't necessarily have the capacity to do that, like, you know, to actually like cross the border and sell drugs in the US. But instead, they would specialize in like local crimes, like local extortion, local control of some territories, selling drugs or selling alcohol or like opening casinos in Mexico and so on, right? So basically, this policy of being very confrontational against drug cartels in 2008 to 2012, backlash. And Mexican homicides doubled during that period. So it was really a very extremely unsuccessful policy. So AMLO basically said, you know what, we're gonna try to control drug cartels, but we're not gonna battle them like Calderon did. We're not gonna do a drug war. We're never gonna, you know, confront them so much. Instead, he thought that he needed to concentrate on the causes, right? So preventing crime rather than confronting crime. And that really didn't work. I mean, homicides reduced slightly, like homicides during the period of Lopez Obrador, homicides reduced 10%. But because homicide had doubled before during the period of Calderon, and then during the period of Peña Nieto, they had increased 50%, you know, a diminish of 10% is not what Mexico needs. Mexico needs much more than that. So I guess you could say that he was successful, but not as much as Mexico required, right? And now Sheinbaum, we are observing, this is not something that she has necessarily said out loud, but we are observing that she is being much more confrontational against the drug cartels. She has a new head of security. His name is Omar Harfouch, and Omar Harfouch has been extremely, you know, open about the fact that he is going to confront drug cartels, that he is going to use the force against them. And he's currently deployed and, for example, working in an area of Mexico that has been recently very violent, called Sinaloa. It's a state in the north of Mexico. And it does look like they are very focused on several things. One is direct confrontation. The second one is also intelligence, and particularly going after politicians that may be helping drug cartels. They did just recently, like a month ago, they captured, I would say maybe like 10 different mayors from the state of Mexico that had links to drug cartels. Some of them from Morena. It was like different parties, but like some of them were from Morena. So that's again like a strong statement, because it's like we're gonna go even after our own people. And then I would say a third one is going after the sources of revenue of the drug cartels. So not necessarily drugs, but some of them are, as I said before, conducting extortion. Some of them now own legal businesses or have created like monopolies in some areas, and they are basically going after that. And making sure that those businesses do not operate anymore. Then finally, the third policy that I would say observe with caution was presented last week. No, it was presented Monday. Sorry, and it's called Plan Mexico, and it's a really ambitious policy. I love it. I think hopefully it works. Like I think if this works, it's gonna be probably it's gonna be probably one of the best administrations in the history of democratic Mexico. Because basically what she is proposing with Plan Mexico is a industrial policy. It's the first time that Mexico proposes industrial policy, I would say since probably the 70s. But in the 70s, what the Mexican government was proposing was like ISR, right? Like import substitution policies. And now what they are actually proposing is the development of more local businesses that can link themselves to the big that can become providers to bigger companies that are exporting to the US, right? So one of the main problems of Mexican companies that are exporting to the US is that a lot of the inputs that they use for production are not necessarily inputs that are made in Mexico, but a lot of them are made in China, for example. So that has become a political concern for Mexico and particularly for the US. And now Mexico is trying to substitute those companies that they are buying from China for Mexican companies. So that means that they are going to have specific programs for development of companies, for development of local technology, innovation. Also, they have a very ambitious plan for changing universities and the programs of the specific universities, and also funding capacitation for workers in companies and so on. So it's a very ambitious policy that includes education, innovation, investment, energy, water. It's very, very ambitious, but the goal being substituting China for products made in Mexico and therefore export to the US without that Chinese content, right? And this is partially pressure because of the pressure of the US to not have businesses with China, right? So let me just summarize what I just said. So good policies of Sheinbaum, I would say, the housing reform, the agency for the digital transformation that is going to provide internet to people and also simplify red tape, and also labor policies, including keeping increases in the minimum wage. Policies that I don't like, that are very controversial and I personally don't like. One is eliminating the Transparency Agency and the Antitrust Agency. Second, ratifying the president of the Human Rights Commission that basically has done nothing. So this is equivalent to basically nullify the Human Rights Commission. And then third, austerity, which I don't think is what Mexico needs. Mexico needs to spend more money in order to develop policies that are much more ambitious. And third, in my classification of observe with caution, I would say the judicial reform, the security policies that have become much more confrontational. So my concern is, hopefully this is not going to happen, but my concern is that Mexico may increase violence, because if it happens, if we repeat the mistakes that we had when Calderon was in power, then this may become, a huge problem for Mexico. And then third, their policy of industrial development that is very ambitious, and still we have to observe the details about how they actually implemented and whether, this is important, whether and how they are going to get the money to actually implement these policies. So let me finish here, Gaspar, and maybe let's open it to questions.
Thank you, Viridiana. Thank you for this survey of not only the context, but also the challenges that Claudia Sheinbaum is confronting. There are a few questions that you touch in the last part of your remarks. And let's see, I'm gonna restate them anyway. Abraham Holly Suarez is asking your opinion on 2 points. One, your perspective on the recently presented Plan Mexico, which you just discussed, and the ability to address the threats of tariffs from Trump. That aspect, maybe you want to comment. And the second one is the internal disputes within Morena and their potential risks to the stability and continuity of the so-called Cuarta Transformación, the Fourth Transformation Project, as well as to Sheinbaum's government. And maybe we can stay with those. Plan Mexico and the tariffs, the threat of tariffs from Trump, and the disputes, the internal disputes of Morena, how they're going to play out Sheinbaum's presidency.
Okay, so Plan Mexico was discussing it a little bit, but let me tell you, like in a nutshell, what my main concern, right? Like one, I already said, the money. Like, how are they gonna get the money to conduct this industrialization policy is unknown because they also don't like to do a fiscal reform. So I don't know exactly how they are gonna manage to do it. But second, and I would say more importantly, is the following. When you observe the history of Mexico, right, and you go back to the 70s and try to understand why, the reasons why the substitution of industrialization was not successful in Mexico, there are many reasons, right? But one of the main reasons given by the literature is that the Mexican government did not provide the incentives to those companies that were receiving, subsidies and like tax cuts and so on. They don't provide incentives for them to actually deliver and become competitive. So a lot of companies were receiving these subsidies, were receiving this support, but there was not like a demand to, okay, but in exchange of these, you need to be this productive, or you need to increase your productivity at this level, or you need to export or increase the amount of products that you export and so on, right? So what happened is that Mexico created a lot of companies that were dependent on the state and that were not good enough to be competitive internationally. That's the opposite to what you observe, for example, with the Asian tigers. I'm simplifying this a lot, but basically the Asian tigers, what they did is they had an industrial policy that required the business that were receiving the benefits to prove that they were exporting, to prove that they were, like growing into becoming more and more competitive outside their own countries, right? So that's a huge difference, because what you created in the case of the Asian tigers were companies that were very competitive. And in the case of Mexico, you created companies that were rentists, that basically live out of the state, and they were not necessarily being competitive, right? So moving forward to from the 70s to today, my main concern is that they do the same, right? And I don't know, if I don't see so far with clarity what are going to be the requirements that Plan Mexico is going to have from the companies that are going to get support. Like exactly how Mexico is going to separate the companies that are being productive and therefore is fine. Like, of course, like invest in the companies that are being productive, creating jobs and so on, versus the companies that are just like lobbyists and rentists, right? And I actually see a little bit like some red flags, because for example, in the Mexico plan, they added a clause that they are gonna help the textile and the shoe leather industry, right? And that's, it's really not very competitive industries. Like that's not where you would like Mexico to go. So then I think that maybe those two are like probably the result of a little bit of lobbying there. And I'm concerned that there is lobbying in Plan Mexico that may spoil the capacity of Plan Mexico to give results. Then, with respect to Trump and the threats of tariffs and like naming the Mexican cartel terrorists and so on. Look, this is a very challenging moment for Mexico because, as you know, Mexicans are one of the main problems according to the narrative of President Donald Trump. And we are a problem because according to him, we took the jobs from the US. We sent a lot of migrants to the US and so on. I don't have to repeat this. So this is a very challenging moment for Mexico because I do think that Trump is gonna deliver on some of his promises. Maybe not in the long term, but I do see Donald Trump imposing tariffs for a few months and being very belligerent, and like showing to his base that he's doing it. I do see Donald Trump increasing the border patrolling and also repatriation of Mexicans and so on. And I do think that's gonna be problematic for Mexico. Like 80% of Mexican exports go to the US. Like if the market of the US gets close to Mexico, that's gonna hurt. That's gonna hurt. But let's say that uh, to be optimistic, I think that the facts are that the US needs Mexico and Mexico needs the US. We have created a powerful region together. And I think that even Donald Trump is going to eventually, and his team are going to eventually notice that. And I think the most damaging policies are going to probably get retracted or are going to probably not be necessarily implemented with as much force as originally thought. So I think that reality, like reality is going to be there, and at some point reality is going to impose itself. And the reality is that the US needs production in Mexico, and also the country benefits from immigration. So I feel that that's at the end that's gonna triumph. About naming the cartel terrorist, I think that's gonna happen, and also that's gonna be problematic for Mexico because, at the end, if the drug cartels get named terrorists, then the weapons that the U.S. have to battle them increase, including, for example, sanctions. And like giving, sanctions to Mexico would be devastating for its economy. Again, let me say again, if the Mexican economy does very bad, then the American economy is also gonna do bad because we are related, we are intertwined. Our production mechanisms are very, very linked. So then again, that's gonna probably inhibit the capacity of the US to hit Mexico so hard, but they are gonna probably try. And then you told me something about the Cuarta Transformación, but I don't remember that part of the question.
Internal disputes within Morena. If you see
Internal
that as
disputes.
a threat to the continuity of AMLO's and Claudia Sheinbaum's plan.
I do think there are a lot of internal disputes, and I have actually written about all of them. Like there are like 4 different factions. All of them kind of like hate each other because they wanted to be president, and Sheinbaum got the presidency instead of them, and so on. So there are some disputes, but here's one thing that I've been recently observing. The Mexican opposition is so weak and is so destroyed that right now whatever politician that would like to live outside Morena would just not survive. Like, if you want to win elections today in Mexico, you need to be part of the Morena coalition. So then I think that today, the same power of Morena, ironically, the same power of Morena and the weakness of the opposition is helping Morena to be kind of like united in the sense that they are the only force that exists and the only force where people are capable of winning elections. Now, that may change in the future. Like probably if at some point the popularity of Sheinbaum is not as large as we are observing right now, like right now she has 80% popularity. That's ridiculous, like it's just even members of the opposition approve her. So then right now with that level of popularity, it will be difficult to fracture for Morena and create an opposition to that. But if at some point she becomes less popular, then the incentives to break Morena would probably emerge. And we have to remember, this is important because historically, the PRI also fracture, like the PRI fractures and creates PRD that later becomes Morena. So, that history of fracture is there, but right now, I don't see that happening, not in the short term.
Thank you. Now, Ruben Hernandez, the director of the Latin American Institute, asked that, given the fact that you have written in some of your columns that Mexican government does not have the money or the financial resources to pay for some of the programs and reforms you just mentioned, how will the government be able to carry out its reforms and programs? Another question is, what is your prognosis uh, about the judicial reform? And you talk about that. The risk and benefits of the election of federal judges. But the first question about the financial resources to carry out the Sheinbaum's program.
So they have, I think for the reforms that they approve, they have the money, but they have limited money. So like for example, they have this housing program, right? And they say they want to construct 1 million houses, and that's great. However, just Mexico City needs 10 million houses, right? So then they have been kind of like 9 million, sorry, but they have been kind of like diminishing the expectations of like, I would say not the expectation, the ambition of their own reforms. So the reforms that they approve, I think they have the money to do them and they are going to continue there, and that's not a problem. The real problem is that they don't have enough money to make the more ambitious programs and the more ambitious reforms that a country like Mexico needs. For example, we need a much better health system. We need a much better education system. We need much more money to develop companies and to help, trigger this industrial policy. So then what they are doing is, shrinking their own capacity and, accepting that they have to live like that. That's very unfortunate.
The next question from Maria Salazar. She's wondering about your opinion on whether or not you think President Sheinbaum is losing the war on drugs. States such as cities like Merida, Yucatan, were considered safe cities and states. Now they're experiencing problems with drug cartels. Now the drug cartels are in most of all, or if not all, states in Mexico. Is she losing the war on drugs?
Look, I would say that maybe I would clarify that this is not a war on drugs, like, and that's something very important to understand, because now what we used to call drug cartels, like these like criminal organizations, are not only doing drugs. Like this is worse, right? Now they are doing extortion, they are doing kidnapping, they are doing all forms of like distorting illegal and legal businesses within Mexico, right? So is Mexico losing its battle to these criminal organizations? I mean, yes, and we have been losing it since the 70s, would be the real question, the real answer, sorry. Like, yes, Mexico has never been entirely, 100% on control over or organized crime. Recently, you could say that they slightly improved because they reduced 10% the homicide rate, but definitely Mexico has a lot to do still, right? A lot to do. Now, in order to solve this problem, they also need much more resources, for example, right? Like I think what they are doing currently with the National Guard and with the new security office, let's see if it works. It's definitely a change in course. But again, this is not this is important to say in the US, because sometimes in the US there is this idea that if Mexico doesn't solve its problems with crime, is because they don't want to, right? And I think that's a very mistaken read. Mexico would love to control this problem, except they don't have the resources, the capacity, and the professionalization to do it. And this is interesting because I do see a path eventually for a partnership with the US, where we actually, together, but really together, not just the US imposing itself to Mexico, really together, trying to define a security policy that works for both countries, because both countries want to control this problem.
Rick Barstow is asking if you could elaborate a little bit more on that. What is an effective way of dealing with the drug cartels?
Oh, okay, so I'm not an expert on security issues, let me say this, right? So maybe I'm not the best person to answer this, but let me tell you what I have read from other experts and what they say would be important. The first one, and very important, is the professionalization of the local police. And remember that I told you that there is a National Guard, and then there are like several, like probably dozens of different local polices. Some of those police departments are very corrupt, and some of those police departments actually, I would say, sometimes work for the drug cartels or work very closely relating themselves with the drug cartels, right? So that's a problem. So we need to like create an homogeneous police like capacity and professionalization in the whole country, such that we are also capable of coordinating forces, right? Because you may have a very good and unpolluted National Guard. I don't believe they are unpolluted, but let's just assume that they are like perfect, policing. But then if you have the local polices that are corrupt, then the line of command is basically broken. And then you cannot enforce properly the law. So I would say that's one very important part. A second important part is not on the part of enforcement. I think is more on the part of the judicial system. Like actually, Mexico needs capacity to uh, prosecute people, those that conduct crimes, judge them, and gives them a penalty for doing it, right? So, and that sounds simple, but it's been extremely complicated. So, there are some metrics that show that about 90% of all of the homicides that happen in Mexico never get punished, right? Either because they couldn't investigate the case, or they investigated but they couldn't find the person, or they found the person but then the person left because the specific procedure that they used, like the legal procedure, was wrong. So then they had to let him go and so on. So then that's something that we definitely need to correct, and that's on the part of prosecution. Right? We need to significantly improve the capacity of the Mexican state to prosecute. And then finally, we do need prevention, right? Like right now, we need to create mechanisms for young people to be um, less prone to join drug cartels and more prone to join legal jobs. So there are some studies that have shown that for very vulnerable kids in Mexico, this trade-off exists, right? Like, should I go work in a manufacturing company that is really paying me the minimum wage and I cannot survive with that? Or should I join the, illegal forces and therefore make a little bit more money, even if I have more risk? So this means that we also need to create attractive jobs, right, in the legal, in the legal part of the economy. And that's, I think, something that Maureen is doing very well, right? But we need much more than that. So we need better salaries, we need better jobs, we need just like a better Mexico, a Mexico that is a middle class country, not what we have, which is mostly a Mexico that is a country of plenty of vulnerabilities.
Thank you. Now, our colleague Luis Escala Rabadán from El Colegio de la Frontera Norte in Tijuana wrote that you pointed out the reduction of poverty in Mexico by the Morena government, but by the same token, these announcements also pointed out two important shortcomings in education and public health. What do you think about this? It seems to be that Morena hasn't been very good at acknowledging its shortcomings.
Yeah, I already said that we need a much better and much more functional health system and a much better education system, right? So I think that's there. In the income part is where Mexico really transformed itself. And because of the way that Mexico measures poverty, Mexico has a multidimensional way of measuring poverty. For those of you that don't know, I'm sure the person that made the question knows, but in this multidimensional measure, you consider income and also access to certain basic goods and services. But income is kind of like, I would say, one of, like, in this form of measurement, is one of the most important variables, because if you if you are above certain threshold, above the poverty line, then you stop being poor, even if you have some carencias, meaning even if you don't have necessarily like access to the best health system or access to education and so, right? So what happened during this sexennium is that a lot of people went above because of the labor changes. A lot of people went above the poverty threshold, which is great. That really, that changes lives, and we cannot deny that. However, there is a need to invest more on health and invest more on education and invest more on other services. And that's clearly there. It's also a debate in the US. The US also needs a better health system.
Thank you. And there's a lot of questions for you, Viridiana, and everybody is following you, have read your columns. So these two questions that are different aspect. One, did President Sheinbaum order changes in the quality of food that was served in school? And the second one is, what about the megaproyectos, Tren Maya, etc., and indigenous rights to prior and informed consent? I'm assuming that those are controversial. So, do you have anything
Yes.
to say about that? And the third one is, what if anything will Claudia do to foster reform of the CENTE, the teachers union? So, quality of
Oh, that's
food, the
a great
megaproyectos,
question.
and the teachers union.
Okay, that's a great reform. Okay, I'm going to start by the last question because that's a great question. Mexico has never been capable, and they have tried many times. Mexico has never been capable of reforming the teachers' union. And the teachers' union currently, actually, the teachers' union was very pampered by López Obrador. He increased salaries, he increased the benefits, and so on. But now, I feel that now is the moment that we start demanding from the teachers' union that they also deliver a little bit more, and that they help increase the quality of education. Of course, this is complicated, and what the union always say is that we cannot do it because if the kids are living in poverty and if they don't have breakfast and so on, how are we going to deliver on the quality of education? So that's kind of like always the debate. But I do think that Sheinbaum should demand slightly more from the teachers. And I think she could do it. She has the force to do it, but I don't think she's gonna do it because and this is very unfortunate because if you look, for example, at who became the Minister of Education with Sheinbaum is a politician, is the former head of Morena, right? But it's not, you know, like why a politician, right? Why not a teacher? Why not somebody that knows about how to actually, push the buttons that we need in order to increase the quantity of education? So having there a politician, it makes me believe that maybe that's not a priority. I think a lot of her priorities, though, are on improving tertiary education, meaning VAs and also PhDs and innovation and research. And she created a specific minister, a new minister of innovation and research, I think is called, that is going to focus exactly on that. And that's one of the parts of the industrial policy program, right? Like creating more innovation in order for Mexico to be capable of exporting products that have more value, right? But again, I don't think they are going to be tough on the unions. And this is, let me just clarify that the debate about teachers unions in the US and the debate about teachers unions in Mexico is very different. And I saw sometimes that people, kind of like conflict those two, and they interpret the unions in Mexico as they interpret the unions in the US. And I think it's completely different. Like the teachers union in Mexico have severe problems. Like they have problems of corruption, have problems of like inheriting their positions to their children. They have conflicts of interest. So we need that's something that needs to get improved. And I'm very pro-union. I'm saying this because I'm very pro-union. And because I'm pro-union, I want to have good unions, right? And I think this is a union that we could improve. Of course, this is complicated, and I'm sure you guys know. Then about the mega projects, well, that's very controversial for environmental reasons, of course, and also because indigenous communities sometimes don't like to have these projects, destroying their traditional form of life. But that's not going to stop. Like, Claudia presented actually a long list of mega projects, particularly railways, that she wants to construct all around the country. And she has this very developmentalist ethos, right? Like that's something also very interesting of Sheinbaum, that uh, AMLO didn't have that. AMLO was like, oh, I want to be good to the poor. I wanna reduce poverty. I wanna give transfers to the people and so on. He was kind of like in the poverty reduction arena, and he felt very comfortable there. And Claudia is like, she is a lion, she's like, we want to make the economy grow. Like, yes, of course, we're going to protect the poor, but we want to make the economy grow. We want to become an industrial, superpower. And we want to substitute China, and Mexico is the next China. She doesn't say it like that, but I think that's what is behind some of her advisors. And that requires, in her opinion, that requires a lot of investment on infrastructure. And this is where the mega projects come from. And she's just gonna do more and more of that. So that's gonna remain being controversial. Now, let me tell you something that, to me, it shocked me. And this is about Tren Maya, right? Tren Maya, a train constructed in the south that, because of the nature of the jungle in the south, when you construct something like this, of course, it's destructive to the local environment and so on. Tren Maya was very controversial because of for environmental reasons. And a lot of people, when you talk to a lot of people in Mexico City, in the US, they were like, no, Tren Maya is the worst and so on. And then when you went to the regions and when you talk to the people there, they were all super happy about it. They were like, we love Tren Maya. Tren Maya is going to improve our lives. This is great. Finally, somebody is doing infrastructure here and so on. There is a poll by El País where they polled people living in the area of Tren Maya, and 80% was in favor, right? So I'm saying this because indeed it's very complex, right? So it's not that all people there is against it, right? Actually, a lot of people is in favor of it. And maybe, I don't know, but maybe some of these projects are required for development. That's a question. That's an open question. I don't know. Then finally, about the foods. Yeah, Claudia banned the selling junk food in at schools. And that's that's like, Claudia is a very competent politician. I think she's much more competent than Lopez Obrador. And she also has a more capacity, well, no more capacity, but desire of planning. Like, she believes on the planned state. So for example, she's like, okay, we have a problem of obesity. How do we solve it? And then they come out with these policies that they implement and are very strong, but are, according to scientists that I have talked to in the Institute of Public, not INSP, Instituto Nacional of Public Health, the National Institute of Public Health. They are very happy about this measure, and it's going to probably help control obesity. 40% of children in Mexico are obese or have problems of overweight. So this is something that Mexico needs to control immediately.
And in the last couple minutes that we have left, um, Gabriela Cruz is asking, do you believe that Morena is the new PRI, given how much power they have centralized, given their concentration of power in Congress, in federal and state level, the militarization of the country? These and other facts could be result in an imbalance. So good intentions have bad consequences. What do you think?
So it's very unfortunate that we have 3 minutes to answer this question, because it requires a whole seminar, Gaspar. And please bring an expert on PRI and invite me, because I've been revisiting the literature of PRI, like myself. I went back and I took my books from history, and I read again Dicta Blanda, I'm sure you know. I read again on revolutionary Mexico, Green, Magaloni, so on, all the literature of the transition, in order to understand exactly this question. And I've been studying this for a little bit of time now. Like exactly, are we just observing a new PRI in Mexico? And my answer is no. My answer is that actually, if we assume that Morena is just another PRI, we're going to misinterpret what is currently happening in Mexico. This is work in progress, but let me tell you what I'm currently thinking. First, pre were many different things over different periods of time and so on. So then we have to take this carefully, right? Because what pre? So, but well, thinking about like the regular characteristics that we associate with the pre, one is that indeed it was an hegemonic party. Morena may become an hegemonic party. Currently, it is not. Like actually, currently, for example, 40% of the population voted for the opposition. So that's that's not an hegemonic party. Morena is powerful. No, like of course it's powerful, but it's not a hegemonic yet. So a good and well-organized opposition could confront Morena, or could at least, own some, get more power than they currently have. Second, he was very corporatist, like they kind of like they created this form of organization in different corporations that they control with different mechanisms, and therefore they created this governability. Morena is not like that. Morena is more like I would say like a charismatic party, right? Like they are united by mostly their love for Lopez Obrador, and as this like extremely charismatic figure. And now, very recently, with the arrival of Sheinbaum, they are going through the process of constituting a party. But we really don't know how that party is going to look. Like we do know it's not going to look corporatist, because those corporations don't exist anymore, but we don't know exactly how that is going to look. So I feel that right now we're in the process of formation of that party, and still it's too early to tell whether that party is going to operate similarly to the PRI or not. And another important thing, the PRI had a more, I would say, um, didn't really differentiate it between, or differentiated less, the president of the party, right? And I think that happened a lot with AMLO. Like, AMLO was Morena, whatever he said was what Morena was saying. But that's not what we are observing with Sheinbaum. Actually, with Sheinbaum, we're observing a very interesting division between what Sheinbaum is doing and saying, and then what the party is doing and saying. And the leaders of the party are not necessarily having are not necessarily does not necessarily conceive Sheinbaum as the leader of the party. Sheinbaum is the president, and she's like operating that part, that administrative part, right? But she's not taking decisions about what is happening in the party. The person taking decisions about what is happening in the party is probably the son of AMLO and another long-term politician called Alcalde, female long-term member of Morena called Alcalde, right? So again, this is a fascinating question. I could endlessly talk about this, but no, Morena is not the new PRI. It's actually a very different animal. It's an animal information, and we need to understand how that animal is. Because if we get confused and we think it's a PRI, we're not going to understand, like, even simple things about how to create an opposition.